These are 5 objectives of a dissertation, but in fact, only one of these objectives is a true objective. The other 4 are not real dissertation objectives, and therefore should play a secondary role as dissertation objectives. In this video, I'm going to explain the 2 types of objectives students usually write for their dissertation. You are going to learn what they are and what differentiates them. I will then revisit these objectives to classify them according to the 2 types. I'll explain why you should prioritize real objectives over the other ones, and I'll also suggest an approach to deal with them while you are doing the dissertation, and then when writing the final objectives to include in your dissertation document. Writing objectives is one of the most critical tasks when doing a dissertation. If you get this wrong, there are likely implications for how you develop and write a dissertation. Objectives are very important to address one of the 6 C's of academic writing excellence. In this instance, the confined C. By the way, if you haven't watched the video on the 6 C's, I'll have a link in the description below. The objectives establish the boundaries for your research. And in practice, your tutor, or whoever is assessing your dissertation, is going to assess it based on how relevant and appropriate is what you've written in relation to these boundaries given by your objectives. In other words, what you do and say needs to be confined to the objectives. So, what are the 2 types of objectives? Objectives actually can be seen as the specific questions through which you are going to answer the research aim. And there are 2 types of objectives. The first ones are what I call process objectives, and the second ones are what I call and true or real objectives. I'll refer to these using these 3 words, and real or true objectives. And if you look at it in your research, you define objectives that are reflecting the tasks that you have to do, and those are the process objectives. They are the activities that are required in order to achieve something, and that something are the true objectives. The true objectives are those questions that initially drove your research. So in terms of approaching your research, I suggest that you treat both as working objectives, but it is very important that in your mind you settle this idea. The real, the true objectives are what guides my research, and therefore I need to prioritize this. Let's look at the difference between these 2 objectives in more detail. We already saw that true objectives are different from process objectives because they guide your research. They are the reason why you are carrying out research, whereas process objectives are the activities that you will be undertaking in order to address those real objectives. Another important difference is that true objectives are answered by your primary data collection. So you're collecting data through questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, and so on, in order to find an answer to the questions that initially drove your research. Whereas process objectives, they are not addressed by the primary data collection. They are part of those objectives are in fact related to making sure that you collect good data from which you can then draw conclusions about the true objectives. Another important difference between the 2 objectives is that in terms of the true objectives, there are only a small number of questions. Your research is driven by the aim and a small number of questions. But as far as process objectives, you can have as many as you want, as many as the tasks, the activities that you need in order to carry out your research. It could be about reviewing the literature. It could be about drawing conclusions from the literature. It could be on designing the interview brief, selecting the sample. It could be about drawing conclusions based on the data. All these could be process objectives. And therefore, there are as many objectives as the activities required to complete your research. I showed you a number of objectives at the beginning, and I said that we would be revisiting those objectives in order to analyze them in relation to the 2 types. So let's see which ones are process objectives and which ones are end or real objectives. If we look at the first one, it's about to critically review the literature on the topic, in this instance, the importance of adopting greening practices within businesses. And because doing the literature review is an activity that you have to do in order to develop any good piece of research, it's actually a process objective. You did not seek to do your research in order to review the literature. You are doing it because it's part of the process. It's part of the research process. If we look at the second objective, it's also about reviewing the literature, but on a different topic. So this is an easy answer now. It's also a process objective. The third one is about carrying out interviews with a group of people, hotel managers, about the implementation of greening practices. And again, this is a process objective. You did not seek to do the research in order to interview people, but you are doing it in order to collect data that will then allow you to answer the research question that is driving your research. Objective number 4 can actually be divided in 2 parts, because we have one part which is about to identify whether hotel managers see the implementation of greening practices as a competitive advantage for their property. And in this instance, this is really what research was trying to do. It's to examine the extent to which a group of people saw doing something, in this instance implementing greening practices, as a source of competitive advantage. And therefore, this is a real objective. It was the question that initially drove the interest of the student in wanting to research the topic. The first part, which is to analyze the findings, I would say that part is also about process, because obviously if you collected your data, you have to analyze the findings. The fifth objective is to make recommendations and offer directions. And I would say this is also a process objective, because every research is expected to make recommendations based on what they found. By the way, I include a lot more examples of process and objectives in the Virtual Tutor online resource, which is a video book-based resource which contains a lot more tips and tools to help you write a better dissertation. The link to the resource is in the description below. So what is the problem with focusing on process objectives? For me, there are 2 main problems. The first one, and perhaps the most important one, is that it acts as a source of distraction. It leads students to take their eyes off the ball, and the ball is the end real true objectives. The second one is that there can only be a small number of end objectives, but an endless number of process objectives. If you think that it's good to write an objective about literature review, why don't you write one about choosing the research method? Why don't you write one about designing the data collection instrument, or discussing the data in relation to the literature, or drawing implications for practice? All these tasks, all these activities are important parts of the process. Why did you single out one about the literature review and ignore the other activities? For me, it doesn't make sense. And therefore, I always advise my students to focus mainly and almost absolutely on the real, true objectives. One of the comments I often get is that, but Miguel, my university or my tutor expects me to cover process objectives too. And I say, that's fine. It's not a problem. Process objectives are valid objectives while you are doing it, because in a sense, they help you to keep track of the activities that you have to do in order to answer the end objectives. When students are keen on having process objectives too, I say, okay, adopt this dual strategy. And here you have the aim and 4 objectives of dissertation. And what the student did throughout the research was to separate the 2 types of objectives. So while doing the research, he kept a list of process objectives and a list of true end objectives. Our discussions were mostly, if not always, focused on the true and end objectives. But the student was quite keen on keeping a range of objectives related to the tasks, process objectives, and I'm fine with it, as long as the student doesn't use those as the focus of the research and the decisions that she's making, and instead uses the true end objectives. When it comes to writing the objectives that are going to be included in the final document, I recommend the student to obviously copy the and the real objectives, but also add two other objectives, two process objectives. The first one on reviewing the literature review, and the second one on discussing the implications of the results for industry and theory. And with this, the student will have ticked the box of including process objectives, but it is guaranteed that he or she will have focused on the real objectives, the true objectives throughout, and was not confused and distracted by the process objectives. Your true objectives are directly related to your dissertation aim, and therefore to your dissertation title. I've recorded a video about the 6 mistakes to avoid when writing your title. And some of these mistakes are also useful to consider when writing your objectives, and in particular your and or real objectives. If you haven't watched the video yet, or if you watched it a while ago, I strongly recommend that you watch it, and you've got a direct link to the video here.